So let's see if we can make ourselves a DIY thermocouple wire welder. What I got here is a bunch of capacitors all hooked up in parallel. So I got this resistor over here, 100 ohm resistor. Just going to start charging up the capacitors, hopefully. So charging. 24 volt battery over there with 18650s. And these are 3800 microfarad capacitors, 35 volt capacitors. So we're about to hit 24. And that should be good enough for a quick test. So I just want to make sure that these capacitors are all good. They're holding the voltage, so we'll check back in a little bit to see if they're still up on like 20 or so volts. So 10 minutes later, and we're still up 20 volts. So let's we got this 6 gauge line coming to our wire. Let's see if see how this goes. So not a great weld, but it is welded. Probably need a little bit higher voltage. This is like 26 gauge. I can probably weld 30 gauge pretty easily, but yeah, all I need to do now is box this thing up and make it look a little bit prettier. So let's see how we put this thing together first. So this is what we got. We got our 30 volt supply, which you can use battery or whatever DC power supply, and we're going to charge through this guy here, which is a 50 watt 100 ohm resistor. That won't put too much burden on the power supply or the battery. And we're going to put a toggle switch in series and a blocking diode so we don't reverse current going backwards. That's going to charge up all our capacitors. And I got like 28 or so of these guys. This is EPCOS capacitor, electrolytic, 3800 microfarads, 35 volts. And that's going to be able to produce, and if you're selecting a capacitor, they make these up to 10,000 microfarads, I believe, but this is just what I had laying around, so I had to use, so many more than you might if you have something else laying around. The thing to consider, though, is the ESR of the capacitors. Some of the big capacitors have, farads, 100 farads of capacitance, but the ESR I've seen on some like the Maxwell supercapacitors is like 30 ohms, which you won't be able to create a good weld or produce as much current with those kinds of capacitors. So consider that when you're building one of these. And to safely discharge the capacitors, I've got a switch here with a bleed resistor, and that's going to be this guy here. And this is only what do we got? 10 watts versus being 50 watts, since it's 700 ohms instead of 100 ohms. So that's what the circuit looks like. I'm going to have these two guys here. That's going to show me my supply voltage, and that's going to show me the charge voltage. And what that is, this is just like a little $8 voltmeter. It goes up to like 99 volts, but you can get that online from Adafruit, and they're pretty cool. But let's see what it's going to look like once we get it in a box. Okay, fast forward a couple of weeks, and we got everything in a box here. I ended up with about 28 capacitors just tacked on with glue, and got our charge resistor in there and our bleed resistor, and we got our battery, power and everything. So let's test to see how much capacitance we got. Okay, we got our stopwatch out, and let's start timing. So here's our equations. We need to get the 90% mark. We got 24 volts for battery, and there's a diode drop in there, so let's call it 24. And 90% of that's going to be about 19.5. So let's start charging. And that's about it right there. So 21 seconds or so. Let's plug that in and see what we got. So we're bleeding that off right now, but let's run that number. And so 21 over 2.2 times 100 is about almost 0.1 farad. And with 35 volts, that's going to give us about 58 joules of energy, which, if we look at this guy, this $2,000 model, gives us about 60 joules. So we're right on par with that. Okay, so the last thing I need to do now, I got vice grips on the negative, and I got my carbon anode there, carbon electrode, excuse me. But yeah, if you can't tell, I went a little bit too hard on the torque on that, and it cracked it a little bit, but it still works. So with my smartphone, so I don't hurt my eyes, I can go in here. And oh, there we go, welded. And this is what happens when you miss. Accidentally hit that contacted with the corner there, so maybe I need some insulation on this guy. But yeah, that's why you need to use the carbon electrode. So all in all, I think I spent around 110 bucks on equipment, hardware and stuff. I got the capacitors for free, so that would have been, I don't know, double my price at least probably. But there you go, you can make it yourself. It's a lot cheaper.